Welcome, everyone. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet today, and pay my respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past and present. Welcome, everyone, to the 2016 Indonesian Update Conference. This is an event that has been going in its 34th year. I'm Schmidt, the Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University, and this event, organized by the ANU Indonesian Project in collaboration with the ANU Department of Political and Social Change, has the broad support of the ANU and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. The ANU Indonesia Project is a leading international center of research and graduate training on the society and economy of Indonesia. And ANU has the largest concentration of scholars working on Indonesian anywhere in the world, of course, outside of Indonesia. And there's a good reason for that. Indonesia is this huge country with so many opportunities right next door to us. Each year, the theme of the conference is different, and this year, today's conference is on digital Indonesia, challenges and opportunities of the digital revolution. It's widely believed that we are in the middle of a technology revolution. The dynamic capacity of the internet to connect and transmit information, as well as the evolving nature of devices and infrastructure owing to digitalization and connectivity, has seen new technologies bring rapid change to many parts of the world, and that, of course, includes Indonesia. The 2016 Indonesian Update Conference, convened by Dr. Ross Tapsell of ANU, Dr. Edwin Jurens of the University of Melbourne, will address the digital revolution and other questions surrounding the digital Indonesia. Speakers for this update conference come from various places around the world. Several come from Europe, many are from Indonesia, and a handful are from other parts of Australia. The general topics today will include digital politics and governance, communication infrastructure, digital humanities and economy, and media and security. We here at ANU are committed to keeping our strength in Indonesian studies at the world forefront. Besides supporting the Indonesia Project, which last year celebrated its 50th year, we recently established the ANU Indonesia Institute. And that's because the study of Indonesia belongs beyond just our humanities parts of the university. Indeed, if we're going to really get the most out of understanding and supporting and being part of this journey to the 21st century with Indonesia, it needs to involve the entire university. And that Indonesia Institute is meant to cut across the entire university. The ANU Indonesia Institute is the 10th of the country and regional specific institute established within the ANU College of Asia and Pacific, but is one of our most important and brings together the full expertise and capacities in that center. In collaboration with the ANU Indonesia Project, the ANU Indonesia Institute will consolidate and broaden our Indonesian-related research and teaching activities across the campus and will also serve as a national resource on Indonesian studies. I hope you all enjoy what is going to be, I think, a remarkably informative conference this year on something probably many of you have not thought about directly, but one should not underestimate the power of this new digital and connected world to disrupt and empower us. So I will now hand over to Greg, and I wish you all the best for today's deliberations. Greg.
Just before you go, Brian. Brian has another commitment, so he needs to leave. But I just wanted to thank him before he goes, because even before he became Vice-Chancellor, he met with a number of Indonesianists and he expressed his deep interest in continuing to foster Indonesian studies at ANU, and I also know that Brian travels to Indonesia several times each year and has extensive links, particularly in the science community in Indonesia. So I just wanted to express our appreciation for your continued support for Indonesian studies at ANU. Thank you. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the two speakers for this session, the political update session of the update, and both of them, even more pleasing, PhD students in the Department of Political and Social Change, of which I'm a member. The first of our speakers is Eve Warburton. She has a bachelor degree or an honours degree in Asian Studies from Sydney University, a master's degree from Columbia University, and she's currently, as I mentioned, doing her PhD on resource economics, resource or politics of resource development in Indonesia. Eve is one of the most impressive young Australian Indonesianists, and we had no hesitation in asking her if she would take on this sometimes quite daunting task of presenting a political update to such a sizable audience. And she's a tremendously capable person, and she's never fazed by any challenge, and she immediately said yes. And so in between all the challenges of being in the final year of her PhD, she's very happily taken on this additional burden of writing about the political developments in Indonesia over the past year. Her discussant will be Bayu Dardias. Bayu is a lecturer in Visipol in politics at the University of Gadjah Mada in Yogyakarta. He's also an immensely experienced researcher, particularly in local politics in a number of Indonesian provinces. And his PhD is in fact a study of aristocratic dynasties in a number of provinces. A very fine study it is too. So Eve will be speaking for about 45 minutes, followed by Bayu's comments for around about 12 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. So Eve, thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg, and good morning, everyone. So, as you can see, today I'll be presenting to you the political update, and my paper is entitled Jokowi and the New Developmentalism. Now, before I explain the premise of my title here, I just want to set the scene a little bit and take everyone back to this time last year. And you'll remember that Jokowi was facing multiple crises. He had conflict within his cabinet. Of course, he faced a hostile and assertive opposition coalition in the parliament. There were tensions with his own party and its chairperson, Megawati Sukarno Putri. And overall, he was looking overwhelmed and out of his depth. He also appeared ill-equipped to be dealing with Indonesia's economic slowdown and rising inflation. And because of all this, public approval was at its lowest since coming to office in June of last year. It was sitting at around 41%. But now I want to fast forward to today, and Jokowi has made the comeback, quite a remarkable recovery. The president has consolidated his political power. He has a formidable governing coalition now in the parliament with 69% of the seats. The red and white coalition, the opposition coalition, looks to be in tatters, and it's no longer a serious threat. And following a cabinet reshuffle in July of this year, the commentariat had all come to the conclusion that basically Jokowi was now the undisputed boss of his administration. Inflation has cooled, the rupiah has gained ground, and because of all this, the president's approval ratings have shot up to 68%, which is the highest it's been since Jokowi came to office. And so it's this political comeback that constitutes the focus of my paper today. And I'll be structuring the analysis around three driving questions. So the first one is really, how did he do it? How did Jokowi consolidate his power and reshape the political map over the last 12 months? And in response to the first question, I offer sort of a narrative account of Jokowi's strategies over the past year. And so the first one, it sort of looks at how he intervened in opposition party affairs in order to bring new parties into the governing coalition. I look at how he asserted his authority over the cabinet in that recent reshuffle. And I also look at the kind of strategic alliances that Jokowi has made outside of political parties in order to shore up his power. And I show that the president took a pretty coercive approach and at times a high-handed approach to building his coalition and to achieving political stability. And this brings us to the second question, which is, throughout this process, can we say that Jokowi broke with established patterns of post-Suharto politics, or has he in fact just perpetuated them? And in answer to this question, I suggest that Jokowi's style constitutes a departure from the methods of his predecessor, President Yudhoyono. But ultimately, Jokowi still applied the tried and true strategy of accommodation. In order to consolidate his power, the president and his allies had to accommodate vested interests, they had to engage in the kinds of political deals and the patronage distribution that is typical of New Order politics. And this brings us to question 3, and we'll now arrive at you'll now understand the title of my paper. And the question is really, now that he has achieved stability, we have more clarity on the president's agenda, and we can sort of ask what kind of leader is he shaping up to be, and indeed what kind of Indonesia is Jokowi shaping. And I argue that over the past 12 months, we can observe a Jokowi-styled new developmentalism beginning to take shape. Jokowi is exclusively focused on a narrow set of pragmatic economic programs, specifically infrastructure, deregulation, and debureaucratization. In its design and in its implementation, Jokowi's developmentalism exhibits a statist and nationalist orientation. The new developmentalism is not accompanied by a program for transparent and clean government. Jokowi appears to have made the calculation that this kind of agenda risks disturbing the political equilibrium that he has finally achieved, and it might disrupt his program for accelerated infrastructure development. Nor is the Jokowi administration interested in pursuing a progressive approach to human rights and justice. And again, the president seems to view this element of government as something that is expendable, and it's simply not a political priority. Now, there are strong echoes of the past in Jokowi's new developmentalism. It recalls the New Order's focus on technocratic economic projects, and its nationalist and its conservative features reflect political and economic trends that in fact predate Jokowi's presidency. And as a leader, Jokowi is defined by a kind of ad hocery. His developmentalism, we can't really say, is the product of a grand strategic plan, or he's not working off an ideological blueprint. So the new developmentalism can only be partly the product of Jokowi's personal agenda and his leadership style, and I suggest that in fact there are structural features of Indonesia's socio-political landscape that are also working to bring Indonesia back to its developmentalist moorings. So that's where we're going to be going over the next 45 minutes or so. 40 minutes or so, I'll stick to 45. So let's get stuck into the first question. So how did Jokowi consolidate his power? How did he manage this? So you'll all remember that when he first took office, Jokowi had only 37% of the seats in parliament. So he was ruling with a minority government. And then over the last 12 months, he's managed to expand his governing coalition, and he now has 69% of the seats in parliament. And he did it using more stick than carrot. So led by the experienced hand of his close ally, Luhut Panjaitan, who was also for most of this year the coordinating minister for politics, law and security, the two managed to pacify an aggressive opposition coalition and bring 3 new parties into government: the National Mandate Party, or PAN, the United Development Party, and I'll call it by its Indonesian acronym, P3, and Golkar. Now, in the wake of their election loss, these 3 parties held leadership ballots in which pro-government or pro-Jokowi and pro-opposition factions were pitted against one another. PAN's leadership ballot was relatively straightforward, and Hatta Rajasa, who you'll remember ran as the vice presidential candidate on Prabowo's ticket, narrowly lost to a pro-government or pro-Jokowi competitor, Zulkifli Hasan, pictured here in the blue. The ballot took place in May 2015, and by September, PAN had joined the coalition. However, the ballots for P3 and Golkar perpetuated deep divisions in both parties, and they faced a situation where competing factions both claimed victory. And the president used these internal conflicts to his advantage. So the Jokowi government deployed a rarely used legal tool to grant legal recognition to the pro-government factions in both Golkar and P3. And this legal recognition is important because it provides the party chairperson with the legal authority over the party's caucus and over other important decisions like the appointment of candidates for local elections. And so months of legal battles ensued between the warring factions, and eventually government pressure compelled both P3 and Golkar to hold new elections, and in both cases, pro-Jokowi factions took control of the party. But I want to just explain in a little more detail the Golkar story because it's particularly revealing of the president's coercive approach to coalition building. So, after compelling Golkar to hold a new leadership ballot, Luhut, on behalf of the president, leveraged his own personal networks within Golkar and pressured Abu Rizal Bakri to step down and not compete for re-election. Many of you will remember that it was Bakri that led Golkar into opposition, and he was an ardent and quite loyal supporter of Prabowo and of the red and white opposition coalition. But with his private businesses in crisis and facing pressure from both the government and from within his own party, Bakri relented. And so when the new ballot was held, all 8 candidates vying for the chairpersonship had already professed their loyalty to Jokowi. But Luhut and Jokowi went even further, and they intervened to ensure the victory of one specific candidate, the notoriously corrupt Setia Novanto. Yes, I saw some people sort of recoil when I said his name. Setia was an attractive option for Jokowi on 2 counts. First of all, in his former role as parliamentary speaker, Setia had proven himself to be a useful ally, and he'd helped the government to pass some strategic pieces of legislation. And second, Setia is a highly compromised figure, and he's unpopular with the public because of his involvement in a string of high-profile corruption scandals. And so as a result, Setia himself understands his own political limitations. He has no presidential ambitions. Setia was therefore preferable to the other likely candidate for the Golkar chair, Ade Komarudin. He's a charismatic, ambitious figure who, had he won the chair, had he had more power, he probably would have nominated himself, or the party would have nominated him to run for president in 2019. It was a possibility. And so with these calculations in mind, Jokowi and Luhut organised their networks, or organised Luhut's networks within Golkar. And what they did was they engaged in an unprecedented level of intervention into opposition party affairs in the post-New Order period in order to ensure the victory of a corrupt, a compromised, but a very useful ally. So, having tamed the parliament, Jokowi then turned to his cabinet. And in July, the president conducted what many called a rather ruthless reshuffle, asserting his authority over his friends and his foes alike. The goal was to consolidate his coalition, of course, but also to establish a more deferential cabinet, one without the kinds of controversies and conflicts that the president had had to deal with in the preceding 12 months. And he also used the reshuffle to clip the wings of a couple of ambitious ministers. And Jokowi came out the other end looking far more authoritative. And many in the media were applauding him for finally taking control of his cabinet and looking a little more presidential. But the reshuffle also revealed the president's deficits and some of his leadership deficiencies. And in several cases, he made controversial decisions, he made embarrassing blunders, the government lost a number of reformist ministers, and overall, the quality of the cabinet, I think, has suffered. Now, Jokowi moved 13 ministers, and so I'm not going to detail all of the changes, I'm just going to offer a few highlights, although probably a more accurate word would be lowlights. You can see some of the pictures here. So, of course, first of all, as many of you would be aware, the president offered the Hanura party chair, Wiranto, a former New Order general, a very prestigious position, the position of coordinating minister for politics, law and security. Now, clearly Jokowi did not seek wide counsel before appointing Wiranto to his new post. Wiranto was indicted for crimes against humanity by the UN back in 2003 for his role in the military-backed massacre of East Timorese in 1999. Now, either Jokowi didn't know the details of Wiranto's indictment, or he didn't regard his involvement in crimes against humanity as having any serious implications. And either way, the president's decision shows a disturbing lack, actually, of insight into what this meant for Indonesia's international image, let alone for human rights, justice, and the possibilities for security reform. Now, in another move that no one was predicting, Jokowi demoted Luhut, who I've just been speaking about, and he demoted him to the Ministry for Maritime Affairs and Natural Resources. Despite being one of Jokowi's longest and most loyal backers, and despite the crucial role that Luhut played in delivering the president his parliamentary majority, the president moved him, and reportedly with very little consultation and no warning. And he did it in order to curb the former general's power, because Jokowi was becoming a little uncomfortable with the outward perception of Luhut's influence over the palace. And there are other examples too where Jokowi acted to control or to remove ministers that he felt displayed a little bit too much ego. And now, personally, this is my favourite lowlight: the shambolic appointment of a new minister for energy and mineral resources. The president's decision to remove the sitting minister, Sudirman Said, didn't surprise anyone, although it disappointed many people. He was regarded as one of the most reformist ministers that the ministry had had in over a decade. And to replace Sudirman, well, I should explain first that the reason Sudirman was stepped down was partly because of his reformist agenda and the combative personal style that he had, which earned him many enemies, including some of the president's loyal strategists and loyal allies like Luhut Panjaitan and also like Rini Sumarno, the Minister for State-Owned Enterprises. And Sudirman also had regular public spats with Rizal Ramli, one of Luhut's allies, and who had previously been the coordinating minister for maritime affairs and natural resources. And these public spats and this conflict really frustrated the president. And so he got rid of Sudirman Said and he appointed Achandra Tahar, this man here on your far right. So Achandra was introduced to the president by one of Luhut's close associates at the presidential staff office, and his name was Darmawan. Now, Achandra is an old university buddy of Darmawan. He has a small consulting business in the USA where he's lived for around 2 decades. Now, Jokowi liked Achandra. He had a personal rapport with him, and there's a family connection there too. And also, I hear that Achandra provided a very nice PowerPoint, and he wore jeans to the presentation, which demonstrated a humble sort of, a humble image. But to cut a long story short, Achandra was a good option for Jokowi, and he was also a good option for Luhut and for other senior members of parliament, senior members of the cabinet, because Achandra had no strong political networks in Indonesia. He had no competing agenda, whether that agenda be reformist or particularistic. And so he wouldn't obstruct other senior members of the government or others in the inner circle of Jokowi when it came to strategic and lucrative resource contracts. Now, unfortunately for Jokowi, Achandra's appointment became very controversial. The media got wind that Achandra was in fact a naturalized American citizen, which is a serious problem given that Indonesia does not allow dual citizenship. And this is the irony here, and I can't help but laugh a little bit, because this is a time of rising resource nationalism and rising anti-foreign sentiment in the resource sectors, and the president appointed an American to run the ministry. Now, in the face of a media firestorm, Jokowi was forced to remove Achandra from his post just 20 days in. And we still have no replacement. But after weeks of intrigue, it looks like we might know who's going to replace Achandra. Jokowi is determined that this man take up his post as the Minister for Energy and Mineral Resources, and no one fully understands why. But what does this tell us? What do all these sort of controversial appointments tell us? Well, I think first of all, it is clear, as the media said, that Jokowi asserted his authority and he did get a more deferential cabinet, and that is good for political stability. But I think it's fair to say that the process was pretty dysfunctional, and it demonstrates some of Jokowi's leadership deficiencies. It's clear that he's calculating, it's clear that he can be uncompromising, but maaf ya, he can be pretty incompetent. So the third strategy that Jokowi has used over the past 12 months to shore up his position is by building alliances with particular individuals. He could not have consolidated his power without this small group of loyal enablers. And his loyal enablers are wealthy politico-business elites and former generals with the financial resources and the political networks that the president needs in lieu of a party machine. Now, in a very sharp post-reshuffle analysis on New Mandela, Thomas Power of the ANU argued that the reshuffle was also significant for who was not removed and who remained in key strategic portfolios. Tom Power suggests that Jokowi protected these personal partisans and placed them in positions that are known to be rich in rent and patronage resources. For example, Rini Sumarno. She's one of Jokowi's closest allies and played a key role in Jokowi's rise to the presidency. She helped finance his presidential bid and organise his campaign. And she's now the Minister for State-Owned Enterprises. And from this position, she also helps guide the president in strategic policy areas, everything from the energy sector to infrastructure as well. PDIP hates Rini. Megawati and Rini fell out shortly after Jokowi won the presidency. And since then, Megawati has consistently demanded that Jokowi remove Rini from cabinet. But Jokowi has refused. He has pushed back against the matriarch of his political party, and instead he keeps Rini in a strategic post where she can command state resources and direct key government policies. Amran Sulaiman is another one of the president's closest allies, and again, he helped finance and organise the Jokowi's presidential campaign, mostly in Sulawesi, Amran Sulaiman's home island. Jokowi made Amran Minister for Agriculture, another ministry rich in patronage opportunities with the authority to distribute agricultural concessions and import licences. And I should add that Jokowi is also fond of Amran and respects him and allows him to drive the government's policy on food security and agricultural self-sufficiency. And then, of course, we've heard a lot about Luhut Panjaitan. He's been around since the very early days as well, a key enabler and a key strategist for Jokowi, and also someone who's been able to provide the financial resources that Jokowi needs. And now, while Luhut was demoted, and he was, from the Ministry of Politics, Law and Security to the coordinating Ministry of Maritime Affairs and Natural Resources, we have to remember that this new post oversees the lucrative energy and mining sectors, and these are sectors in which Luhut has direct personal business interests. The post gives him control over large oil and gas contracts that are not only strategic in terms of Indonesia's energy security and the economy, but they're also strategic targets for rent seeking. So the point here is that since the days of the campaign, Jokowi has not been able to rely on a party machine. PDIP has not offered, nor has its chairperson offered him consistent support. And for this reason, he has cultivated personal alliances with powerful and wealthy individuals outside of political parties. And according to Tom Power, Jokowi will keep these individuals in strategic ministries as a strategy to, quote, resource and manage a re-election bid that limits his indebtedness to parties. And so this brings us to question 2. In consolidating his authority over both the Parliament and the Cabinet, has Jokowi broken with established patterns of post-Suharto politics, or has he simply perpetuated them? Jokowi's high-handed style, I think, marks a departure from the more accommodative methods of his predecessor. Yudhoyono secured stable coalitions with carrots rather than sticks. He welcomed parties inside with open arms, promising them patronage and providing them with cabinet positions. Jokowi, meanwhile, used more stick than carrot in order to achieve a parliamentary majority. And he intervened in opposition party affairs. And his decision to endorse Setio Novanto, I think, is a particularly powerful demonstration of the president's priorities and his embrace of realpolitik. Jokowi has also been far less willing to offer his new coalition parties ministerial posts. So, for example, even though Golkar has 91 seats in Parliament, the most of any other party after PDIP, they only get one ministry. And P3 got nothing extra after it entered the governing coalition. And so this also stands in contrast to SBY's approach, who distributed posts based loosely on the proportion of each party's seats in Parliament. And when it came to the reshuffle, Jokowi took a high-handed approach, asserting his authority, removing obstructive ministers, some of them reformists, and trimming the tall poppies in his cabinet, often without warning or consultation. So this year we saw a kind of Machiavellian dimension to Jokowi's leadership style that really wasn't on display during those first 12 months in office. And to be sure, and I think we have to remember this, that the hostility that Jokowi faced in Parliament and the fractiousness within his own cabinet necessitated a particularly assertive response. Nonetheless, the autocratic strain, I think, in Jokowi's personality has surprised commentators and insiders alike. Yet, while some of Jokowi's tactics and his personal style might stand out as different, the president has ultimately stuck to a strategy of accommodation that is the hallmark of post-Suharto politics. Jokowi expanded his coalition to form a formidable majority, he struck deals with oligarchs, and he engaged in patronage politics, and he had to accommodate vested interests. And the president also placed his loyal enablers in strategic posts, giving them command of state resources and authority over lucrative industries. And I think it's important now to remember that when Jokowi first came to office, he flirted with the idea of doing things differently. He thought he could rule with a minority in parliament, perhaps build a coalition, tanpa syarat, or without conditions. And Jokowi wanted his government to look different to SBY's and to avoid the rainbow coalitions for which his predecessor was famous. But that tumultuous first 6 months in office really taught Jokowi that such a course of action brings too much political risk. And so in pursuit of power and stability, the president has embraced established patterns of post-Suharto politics. It appears that over the past 2 years, the imperatives of running a stable government in Indonesia's patronage democracy have left their mark on the president. And I want to end on a quote which I think is very telling. One cabinet member said to me, reflecting on the last year of Indonesian politics, he said, in 2016, it became clear to him and to others in the cabinet that Jokowi was just a normal politician. So that brings us to question 3. And it really speaks to the implications of Jokowi's consolidation. Now that Jokowi has established his authority and he's achieved stability, what is his agenda? And what kind of Indonesia does he hope to create? And I suggest that over the past 12 months, a new Jokowi-styled developmentalism has begun to take shape. The Jokowi administration is focused exclusively on this narrow set of pragmatic and technocratic economic programs. And in the design and delivery, the government exhibits a statist and nationalist ideological orientation. The new developmentalism reflects Jokowi's personal preference for practical and tangible economic goals. And it recalls the developmentalist ideas and methods of Indonesia's recent past. This developmental agenda is not accompanied by a substantive program for reforming Indonesia's corrupt political and state institutions. And the Jokowi administration over the past 12 months has taken an increasingly conservative approach to issues of human rights, an issue that is apparently expendable in the eyes of the president. Over the past 12 months, Jokowi has paid attention to what counts politically. And he won't pursue any kind of program that risks disturbing his hard-won political stability or that diverts his energy from the prize. And the prize is 2019. Jokowi's strategy is to maintain his authority over parliament and cabinet and deliver a handful of economic outcomes to the electorate, and everything else falls outside of his tunneled vision. So the new developmentalism, what is his agenda? Jokowi views the state's principal task as one of service delivery. Now, he was famous initially for his free education and free health programs for the poor, but now the president directs all of his energy into promoting the government's agenda for an infrastructure boom. In Jokowi's State of the Nation address in August of this year, he proclaimed it the year of accelerated national development. Jokowi's speech was inwardly oriented, with little time spent on foreign policy, no recourse to the sort of Yudhoyono-style platitudes about transparency or justice or democracy. It was all about the government's program for addressing inequality and poverty, which can be summed up in his 3-word mantra: infrastructure, deregulation, debureaucratization. Jokowi travels the country promoting this agenda. And this year he was focused specifically on a set of deregulation packages along with a tax amnesty scheme, which are both aimed at attracting the necessary capital for his big infrastructure boom. And the boom consists of several different programs, but I guess the standout ones are the 35,000 megawatt program, which aims to bring an extra 35,000 megawatts into the electricity grid, plans to upgrade and develop 5 port hubs and 19 feeder ports, to build almost 4,000 more kilometres of new road, and to reach 100% clean water access. Now, all of these policies are marketed as pro-poor. The government argues that infrastructure will alleviate regional inequality, create economic opportunity in the outer islands, and jumpstart stagnating growth. Now, at events around Indonesia, Jokowi speaks to business people, to local legislatures. He speaks to foreign investors, and he speaks with a rare energy about his plans to cut red tape and modernise Indonesia's infrastructure. And on this particular topic, Jokowi engages his audiences in a way that is quite unusual for the president. Often his speeches tend to be a bit wooden and colourless, and he reads straight from his printout. But on these issues, he can go off script, and it's clear that this developmentalist agenda is where Jokowi's passions lie. Now, the new developmentalism demonstrates a renewed commitment to a statist and nationalist ideology. To be sure, we have seen and we will continue to see the selective embrace of liberal policies and market-oriented policies along the way. So the government's 13 economic deregulation packages are designed to incentivise private investment in specific industries and, of course, with an emphasis on infrastructure. And the 10th package lifts caps on foreign investment for 35 industries. But these programs of liberalisation are highly circumscribed and seen as the last resort for attracting money under conditions of serious budget constraint. Overall, the government's approach to development bears the hallmarks of statist nationalist ideology that is typical of developmentalism and typical in the Indonesian context. It's statist because it views state intervention as a necessary component of accelerating national development, and it's nationalist because that intervention is justified in the name of building state strength and capacity and reducing reliance upon foreign companies and foreign capital. For example, while the government courts the private sector in some areas of the economy, the state has focused on boosting and providing more capital to the state-owned sector. The Minister for State-Owned Enterprises, Rini Samano, has ensured that special privileges are distributed to state-owned companies, providing them with access to capital and allocating them strategic contracts. And for example, in last year's budget, the SOEs received an extra $4.1 billion, and there are plans afoot to merge and streamline the state-owned sector and the state-owned companies in it by establishing large holding companies for key industries. Jokowi also seems to be committed to the idea that the state should control imports and nurture local industry, and his administration argues that reliance on foreign goods will undermine domestic productivity and long-term industrialisation. And in the natural resource sectors, Jokowi's government continues to pressure foreign companies and dictate onerous conditions for investment, despite the pressures of the global commodity boom. So, in sum, Jokowi's agenda is avowedly developmentalist, it's pro-poor, and it's statist and nationalist in its aspirations. Liberalisation is a last resort, and it's directed in a limited way to those areas of the economy deemed crucial to the president's developmental agenda. Now, Jokowi himself has no deeply held commitment to a particular economic ideology. The president takes a rather ad hoc approach to economic policy, trialling new ideas and listening to very different sorts of economic thinkers. And in fact, his background as a businessman led many analysts to believe that he would be more open to foreign investment and market-oriented policies. But Jokowi assumed the reins of power during a time when nationalist ideas had become a prominent feature of economic policy making in Indonesia. And indeed, Yudhoyono's second term was characterised by an increase in protectionism and limits on foreign companies. Jokowi is riding this wave, and he now leans towards the nationalist position, reflecting the ideological persuasion and the interests of those around him, and indeed of a large portion of Indonesia's political and policy-making elite. And so it seems, therefore, that the statist and nationalist sensibilities of Indonesia's political class are also leaving their mark on the president, and that he's responding to the structural imperatives of economic policy making in Indonesia. Now, the new developmentalism comes with no serious plan for dealing with corruption or promoting clean government. And many commentators these days sort of assert that Jokowi was never really a reformist, and that his somewhat naive fans, some in the media, some in academia, built him up to be someone that he never really was. And by implication, critiques of Jokowi in this area, and his poor performance in this field, are somehow misplaced. But I disagree. Clean government was once front and centre of Jokowi's political identity, and he invested in this image because he believed it to be an important source of his political capital. And so this is just a photo from him in 2012, back when he was governor of Jakarta, here pictured with Adnan Praja from the KPK. Now, and even in the early days of his presidency, he also began to act out a reformist agenda. But the political circumstances changed quickly, and Jokowi now sees little benefit in pursuing a reformist agenda when it comes to corruption. It's simply not a priority. The president now eschews anything that might resemble an anti-corruption crusade, and he avoids the kinds of institutional changes that might confront or disrupt the political equilibrium and his strategic alliances. Jokowi appears now to subscribe to this idea that anti-corruption reforms are inefficient and they hold back development. And this is a conventional position within Indonesia's political establishment. Now, I want to illustrate in a little more detail how and why Jokowi's brief flirtation came to an end by looking at two cases. And one is reform of the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, and the other is the government's sort of more general passive approach to corruption. So in the early days of the Jokowi presidency, the Ministry for Energy and Mineral Resources appeared to be on the brink of an institutional renaissance. The president offered his minister, then Sudirman Said, full support to introduce several groundbreaking reforms. So the government removed the petrol subsidies that had burdened the state budget for years. Jokowi and Sudirman established an ad hoc team to investigate the notoriously corrupt oil importing sector and the alleged mafia that controlled it. And this was something that no previous minister nor previous president had been brave enough to do. The president also appointed Amin Suryanadi, a former deputy chair of the Corruption Eradication Commission, to the oil and gas regulator SKK Migas, which had been plagued by bribery scandals and suffered systemic corruption. Sudirman shook up the bureaucracy at ESDM, changing over 1,000 positions and introducing ad hoc teams for innovative policy design. But after 6 months, the president's support for reform began to wane. Sudirman, this is Sudirman here, the big picture, and you'll remember Setia Novanto and Luhut Panjaitan soon to make a starring role in this case study. Sudirman's attempts to take on established rent seekers and introduce a more technocratic management style brought him into regular conflict with politico-business elites, including some of Jokowi's closest allies like Luhut and like Rini. Nor did Sudirman always take the nationalist position. In the name of contract sanctity or in the name of cultivating a more friendly investment environment, he would defend the position of some of the biggest foreign companies working in the sector. And this made him unpopular amongst nationalist politicians. So all of these conflicts were disruptive, and Jokowi's support for Sudirman began to wane. Now, Sudirman's fate was sealed in late December 2015. Sudirman had helped expose a secret recording in which Setia Novanto, who was then parliamentary speaker, and a shady oil trader by the name of Reza Khalid, of the mafia that Jokowi had recently tried to extinguish, tried to extort shares and business opportunities out of Freeport, the country's biggest mining company. And they implicated Luhut in the deal. And this recording went public. It was all over the media. It caused a sensation, and it dominated headlines for weeks, and one overexcited observer even likened it to the Watergate scandal. Sudirman led the charge against Setia Novanto, and expected the president's support. After all, he was the whistleblower, and he had exposed rent-seeking and extortion at the highest levels. But Jokowi's support was not forthcoming, and in fact the only casualty of the Freeport scandal was Sudirman himself. Why? Well, because Luhut and Setia had proven themselves to be politically valuable to Jokowi by helping him to pacify a hostile opposition in parliament. And Sudirman's reformist crusade, on the other hand, was disruptive. He obstructed ministers that were close to the president, and he destabilised the cabinet. So as a result, while Setia was stepped down from his position as parliamentary speaker, he still enjoyed the president's backing for the chairmanship of Golkar. And since the latest reshuffle, Luhut has been given oversight over the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, and thus over the Freeport contract. During his second year in office, the president rarely met with or consulted with his minister and excluded Sudirman from all strategic resource decisions. The president had essentially turned his back on his minister and the agenda that they once seemed to share. Sudirman's replacement, Achandra, was, and possibly still will be, expected to defer to other powerful figures in the government when it comes to strategic resource contracts. And again, I want to end on something that a senior member of the ministry said to me, because I think it captures really what happened here. And he said that during Jokowi's second year on the job, the president stopped listening to professionals and only listened to the political strategists in his inner circle. Their goal is not reform, it is political success. And overall, beyond the Ministry for Energy and Mineral Resources, the government's anti-corruption agenda is pretty weak. In the past, Jokowi aligned himself with the anti-corruption movement. When he was governor of Jakarta, for example, he publicly approached the KPK and asked them to assist him in his fight against corruption. And after his presidential victory, Jokowi invited the KPK to help vet potential ministers for the new cabinet. However, the conflict between the KPK and the National Police back in 2014 really bruised Jokowi, and he's been tepid in his support for the Corruption Eradication Commission and for the movement more broadly. In fact, Jokowi now exhibits an approach to corruption that really aligns with the conservative position of many within Indonesia's political establishment. He argues for a preventative rather than a punitive approach, and he promotes a prevention program that outlines things like positive thinking, integrity, and humbleness amongst the bureaucracy as tools for eradicating corruption. Jokowi has also come to the conclusion that the criminalisation of corruption slows down the bureaucracy and stalls development projects. And so he has instructed the courts and the police to avoid investigating and criminalising those involved in overseeing key infrastructure projects. So essentially what this means is that rule of law is subordinate to economic development. Now there is one important caveat here, and that is that Jokowi has so far delayed the Parliament's proposed revisions to the Corruption Eradication Commission law, which would place new restrictions upon the institution's powers of investigation. The polls show the changes are deeply unpopular with the public, and so he's not keen to rush them through. But overall, the President has opted for an approach to corruption that is unobtrusive, uncontroversial, and far less threatening to the political establishment. And it's also an approach that he believes will be more conducive to the acceleration of his development projects. So the story that emerges from both of these cases is one of a president who once saw political value in an anti-corruption agenda. He flirted with the idea of institutional reform and doing things a little differently at a time when, off the back of a very unique presidential campaign, it seemed plausible that he could. But Jokowi has learnt that reform is complex and it's full of political risk. He doesn't really like complexity, and nor is he willing to risk the stability that he has achieved and the alliances that he's built over the past year or so. And for similar reasons, human rights and historical justice are also not on Jokowi's agenda. So first to this matter of justice for historical human rights abuses. During the 2014 campaign, Jokowi promised his government would investigate past abuses, including the massacre of communist sympathisers in 1965 and 66, and state violence against political activists in 97 and 98. Now, even at the end of his first year, scholars and activists expressed bitter disappointment at Jokowi's inaction. But I think there remained at that stage an implicit sense of hope that if Jokowi could rule from a position of strength, then these sorts of issues would come back on the agenda. But this hasn't been the case. Now, importantly, the government did support a civil society-led symposium on the 1965-66 massacres, and that was unprecedented. At the symposium held in April, survivors of the massacres were given a public forum to describe the events of 65 and 66 and the decades of discrimination that they and their families suffered under the Suharto authoritarian regime. But Luhut, speaking on behalf of the government, refused to acknowledge the scale of the massacre and was adamant that there would be no apology to victims. And so, while it provided some space, the state still simultaneously, in fact, shut down the possibility of justice, reparations, or even a symbolic apology. And I think Jokowi's alliances with conservative elites, and particularly those within the TNI, are probably shaping his thinking and his position on these issues. He has placed conservative military figures in government and in his inner circle. And just to name a few, we of course have Riamizard Riachudu, the Minister for Defence, who recently said that communists and their sympathisers deserved to die in 1965. We have Hendro Priyono, someone who's very close to the president, otherwise known as the Butcher of Lampung, for a massacre he was involved in the late 1980s. And he was the former head of BIN and allegedly masterminded the death of Indonesia's most prominent human rights activist, Munir. We know the story of Wiranto, and of course he appointed Gatot Nurmantio to head the TNI, the Indonesian National Armed Forces, a paranoid ultra-nationalist who was strongly against moving forward with any sort of justice or reparations for the victims in 1965 and 66. But I think it's important to remember that Jokowi is probably like most of the Indonesian population, and 90% of Indonesians trust the TNI more than any other institution in the country. So I think it's reasonable to assume that Jokowi is now convinced by these generals' position that the path of justice and reparations is politically dangerous, and at the very least it would bikin gaduh. It would just provoke chaos and disruption. And for the most part, the president has been silent on a number of other pressing human rights issues. When it comes to protecting religious minorities like the Ahmadis, or defending the LGBT community against hateful rhetoric and discrimination, the president has been pretty much absent from debate. He continues to execute drug traffickers and imprison drug addicts at alarming rates, though I guess now, after Duterte, Indonesia looks like a shining bastion of humanitarianism. And the president has done little to abate a recent panic amongst politicians and the military about an imagined resurgence of communist activity. But none of this is going to hurt Jokowi politically. The electorate itself is increasingly conservative. During the late Yudhoyono years, observers were widely discussing the emergence of illiberal attitudes and practices amongst both political and societal groups, and polls show an increasing intolerance towards people of other religions and minorities, and a sustained fear of communism, and of course widespread support for the death penalty. So again, Jokowi is paying attention to what counts politically, and there's simply no political capital in pursuing a progressive approach to human rights issues. And there's little evidence that the president himself holds any personal or principled commitment to human rights as well. So to recap, Jokowi's new developmentalism is pragmatic, it's pro-poor, it's statist and nationalist in its ideological orientation, it's conservative in its approach to both problems of corruption and law reform, and conservative in its approach to justice and human rights. And it appears as though Jokowi might have hit upon a winning formula. As we've seen, the president's approval ratings have improved steadily over the past 12 months. And the latest Indikator survey indicates that after the July reshuffle, his approval rating has hit an all-time high of 68%. And if you ask the question of Jokowi's capacity to lead, then the approval shoots up to 74%. So the public haven't punished Jokowi for his retreat from reform and his agenda for transparency and clean government. And I think the public are in fact willing to forgive him this because the president himself continues to appear clean, humble, and above the fray. And they approve his conservative approach to issues on human rights. And so the polls tell Jokowi that his strategy is a safe one. Indonesians are satisfied with the newfound political stability, and his narrow developmentalist agenda appears to resonate. And we can see this last trend not just in the polls. Over the past few months, we've seen a stream of warm and nostalgic comparisons in the media, comparisons between Jokowi and Suharto, the New Order autocrat who governed Indonesia for 32 years. Jokowi's approach does recall Suharto's preference for pragmatic developmental programming, and there are some rather uncanny similarities. Suharto's speeches in the late 1980s and 1990s focused specifically on deregulation and debureaucratization, which of course he went to pains to emphasize this was not a program of liberalization, but one of modernization of Indonesia's infrastructure and its investment regime, just like Jokowi today. Jokowi loves seeing himself as the hard hat president. He visits infrastructure projects all around the country as often as he can, and he looks like he's marketing himself as the next Bapak Pembangunan, or the father of development. Some in the media even refer directly to Jokowi as a little Suharto, in part because of his developmentalist agenda, and in part commenting on his personal style. Analysts and government insiders invariably refer to the two presidents' common Javanese heritage. Now, I'm not convinced by culturalist arguments, but their point really is I think that these are two quietly spoken, low-profile developmentalists, both of whom demonstrate a deceptively cunning knack for political manipulation. Now, I don't want to labour the point because there are obviously many more differences than there are similarities, and most importantly, Jokowi is a democrat, not an autocrat. But the reaction from the Indonesian commentariat and the electorate at large, I think, is telling. By accident or design, Jokowi has tapped into what Aspinall has described as a widespread, though diffuse, mood of nostalgia for the years of the New Order and those golden years of economic achievement. And for many Indonesians, Jokowi might be the president to resurrect this developmental success of the recent past. So, if the president can continue to maintain political stability, sustain his own personal image as clean and humble, and realise some of his infrastructure goals, and of course control inflation, then he'll probably be rewarded at the ballot box. But all of this is in fact very tenuous. Jokowi's popularity is highly contingent upon inflation and upon oil prices. The budget is under serious pressure, and the president's core policy projects like the tax amnesty, those deregulation packages, and the 35,000 megawatt projects are all suffering from serious setbacks. And the president's own personality and his leadership deficiencies could also be a setback on the road to 2019. As I said, Jokowi is defined by ad hocery and an arbitrary approach to policy problems. He settles problems on a case-by-case basis and on the advice of very different sorts of people. He makes decisions in a rash and an often rushed way without wide consultation. And these attributes make it very difficult to predict how the president will manage an increasingly complex set of budget challenges and how he will realise his ambitious infrastructure goals that we know are racked by logistical problems, corruption, and political infighting. Jokowi is not working off a strategic plan or a developmental blueprint. He has a very simple agenda: improve infrastructure and provide public services. And beyond this, he is changeable, he is unpredictable, and something of a blank slate. So over the last 2 years, Jokowi has been responding to and moulding himself to the political economy that he inherited. He is managing to master Indonesia's patronage-driven democracy, and he is embracing the tailwinds of economic nationalism that predates his presidency. And he's acting out the conservative sensibilities of Indonesia's political class. Jokowi offers a fast, ruthless, no-frills implementation of the status nationalist development strategy that has long loomed large in Indonesia. And so for these reasons, I think we have to see the nationalist, the status, and to an extent the conservative features of this new developmentalism as reflecting deeper ideological and structural imperatives of Indonesia's post-Suharto political economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eve, for a wonderfully assured, informative and deeply insightful presentation. And now it's my pleasure to ask Bayu Dardias to give some comments in his role as discussant. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. Listening to Eve made me think that politics in Indonesia over the last 3 years has been similar to the first Star Wars trilogy. First, there was A New Hope, with Jokowi's emergence in 2014. Then, Prabowo and Megawati played starring roles in Empire Strikes Back in 2015. And in some ways, as Eve has shown, it's Return of the Jedi in 2016. However, in this Indonesian version of Star Wars, it seems we are not sure if Jokowi is really a Jedi. But of course, this is not Star Wars update, this is Indonesian update. So, as we have just been thinking about national level politics, in my remark, I'm going to do 2 things. First, I would like to comment on something Eve did not have time to discuss, which are some political development in the sub-national level. Then secondly, to pick up where Eve left off, and despite of being few years away, I would like to provoke some speculation on who may emerge to run against Jokowi in the 2019 election. So, the first one, to the sub-national trend. It is very important to understand what is going on at the local level because it is structurally different to the national level. As we know, since decentralization, Indonesian politics is as much about what happened in the region as at the national level. Since 2005, people have been able to choose district, city, and provincial level executive leaders through local direct elections or pilkada. From 2005 to 2013, local electoral commission organized these direct elections independently of one another. However, since the last Indonesian update in September 2015, we have had 269 elections, most of them on one day in December 2015. Let's talk about what happened in those elections. Most importantly, from this recent election, we can draw 3 interesting contrasts with the national level politics as described by Eve. First of all, Eve pie chart map out the contrast between opposition versus government parties at the national level. There is no such polarization at the local level. 70% of the winning candidate in this 269 election, which is half of the number of local elections in Indonesia, were proposed by parties which sit in both government and opposition parties at the national level. Candidates exclusively nominated by either national level government parties or national level opposition parties made up only a small minority of winning candidates at the local level. The number is about 16%. This suggests that politics at the national level, where there has been a clear 4-month distinction between opposition and the government coalition, as he has showed, has never really been reflected in district, city, and provincial election. Secondly, one positive development is that the local elections serve to undermine some established dynasties. A number of representatives of powerful dynasties lost against other challengers. In Sopeng district, in South Sulawesi, for example, the son-in-law of the governor, Syahrul Yassin Limpo, and his running mate, the son of the incumbent, lost. In Pasuruan, East Java, the incumbent Ismail Hassani lost even though 4 of his family members sit in Loka's legislature. Furthermore, this is very interesting, Idam Samawi's political dynasty ended in electoral defeat in Bantul district, Yogyakarta. Idam Samawi's family controlled a major media business. His family had been in control of Bantul district since 1999. A lot of people mocked his challenger, an ordinary ex-policeman Suharsono, as a puppet candidate, as if he did not have a serious chance, but he won. Even in some areas where dynasty still won, serious infighting threatened their long-term survival. In Goa district in South Sulawesi, for example, the recent local direct election created tension between members of Yassin Limpo dynasty. The Yassin Limpo dynasty in Goa have controlled the regency for at least 20 years. Adnan, the son of the previous regent, Ihsan Yassin Limpo, and the nephew of the South Sulawesi governor, Syahrul Yassin Limpo, won the fight with his aunt Tenri Ole Yassin Limpo over Goa regency. Of course, it is unclear what role of this internal conflict will play in shaping dynasty's future prospect, but the family has emerged rather wounded from the recent election. Thirdly, in last December election, a new development was the phenomenon of calon tunggal, or the sole candidate, where an incumbent candidate is very strong and nobody wants to run against him or her. In some cases, this led to a situation where only one candidate ran for office without a competitor. In such election, voters could choose to accept or reject just a single candidate. See, this is only one picture here, and you should accept or reject, setuju or tidak setuju. This mechanism had been decided by the Constitutional Court just a few months before the elections. There has been 3 single candidate elections in Bital district in East Java, Tasikmalaya district in West Java, and North Central Timor district in East Nusa Tenggara province. In each of the sole candidate elections, the candidate was approved by more than 70% of voters, in one case 90%. But there were also other cases where there was no serious interest to running against the incumbent, and the leading nominee had to, quote-unquote, encourage other candidates to run to create the impression of competitiveness. We call it a puppet candidate or calon boneka. What does it mean actually for local democracy? There are 2 sides of the coin. On one positive side, we have well-performing, public service-oriented leaders like Tri Risma Harini or Risma in Surabaya. These candidates win because of genuine approval toward their policies. On the other hand, however, some candidates gain a strong electoral position with their power to dispense patronage and buy votes. This occurred, for instance, in Serang district and Kuta Kertanegara district. These political dynasties remain strong. Therefore, the sole candidate phenomenon is an accurate reflection of the ambivalence of local democracy, with both the most effective and the most corrupt leader winning elections. Now, this reflection on electoral dynamics brings us back to the national level politics, because one major question arises out of its if presentation. who can possibly challenge Jokowi. Since we have been comparing Jokowi with Suharto, could it be, for instance, that in 2019 election, we return to the bad old days with the sole candidate in Indonesia will be both possible and permissible? In other words, could we have just a sole candidate for the presidency again? I don't think so. So, here's some thought on potential challenges to Jokowi and his new developmentalism. Remember, Jokowi himself was just a local leader a few years ago. So, we need to ask, will Jokowi's challengers once again come from the local level and have an untarnished record like him? Or alternatively, will old elites rise again? Of course, it's a bit too early to talk with any kind of certainty, but it's certainly provocative for the coffee break, which is happening soon, to speculate. First, let's think about potential candidates. They are coming from old elites. Prabowo seems to be interested in participating again in the next election. In fact, over the last 10 years, and possibly longer, I think there has been nothing that he has wanted more than to become a president. He will be 68 years old in 2019, so it will be his last shot. Then there's Megawati, who seemed too old to run for the presidency, but she could give his blessing. May the force be with you. To one of his party officers, the term that she used to reflect to Jokowi when nominating him in 2014. Or maybe Wiranto. He is now an extremely influential position after all. The position of coordinating minister for political, legal, and security affairs was Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono's position before he became president. But the only one who seemed capable of mounting a challenge to me is Prabowo, as shown in the recent poll from CSIS here. So Prabowo was still in 24%. Secondly, the new potentially reformist leaders might challenge Jokowi using the same path that he took between 2012 and 2014. Risma, Surabaya's mayor, was dominant in the last year local election, and she has built up a national profile. Ridwan Kamil, Bandung's mayor, might skip the West Java governor election in 2018 and focus on the presidential position election instead. And of course, we still have Ahok, Jakarta's governor, who will be tested in the second round of concurrent local direct election in February 2017. These three figures, Risma of Surabaya, Ridwan Kamil of Bandung, and Ahok of Jakarta, have been all over my Facebook feed since the last Indonesian update, showing that they understand how digital Indonesia ticks. It could be that Jokowi forged a new path for other local level candidates to win the presidency. In short, I would like to close this by, even though it is currently not clear whether Jedi Jokowi remains loyal to the Force or have crossed the dark side, I'm optimistic that many other good Jedi can arise. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Bayu for those very amusing comments. Bayu did admit last night that he'd not seen Star Wars, is that correct? So it shows you how it's entered popular consciousness. So we have about 10 or 15 minutes with a bit of indulgence from the organisers for questions. We have an innovation this year in that Bu Lydia has a live, this is being live streamed, the entire session, and she has Twitter feed from Indonesia. So we'll take the questions in groups of 3. We'll have 2 from the floor and 1 from Lydia, and hopefully we can fit in 2 rounds. I would ask you to be as brief as you can, to identify yourself and your organisation before you ask the question. So hands up. So John first of all. Yes, second there, and Lydia third. So let's begin with John Monfries. Wait for the microphone, John.
John Monfries from ANU. I noticed that neither speaker has mentioned the Vice President, Yusuf Kalla. He was a very activist Vice President on the first time he was Vice President, but I get the impression that he isn't so much of a player these days. And would he run for President again?
Thank you. And second question just there.
Hi, I'm just wondering what your take is on.
Just mention your name. Some of
Sorry,
us know
my
you.
name is Kathleen. I'm from Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. Just wondering what your take is on the proposed GBHN, the implementation of GBHN to reduce the presidential force, and also the proposed changes in the election that previously gave votes to the most nominated candidates. Now it will be pushed to the party's decision again. So.
Yeah. So you got that? Yeah. And the GBHN is a 5-yearly presidential plan thing from Suharto era. Last of all, Lydia.
Yeah. This comes from Amalinda Safitriani, who is watching through the Facebook live stream. She's the head of the political department at UGM. And she asks, what is the role of relawan or voluntary groups and the citizens in this political landscape?
Thank you. Eve, do you want to begin?
Yes. Okay. During Jokowi's first year in government, Yusuf Kalla had more of a prominent role, but what emerged was this sort of internal tension between two different elite networks. And we sort of had Yusuf Kalla on one side, and then a kind of another emerging network with Luhut Panjaitan and others. And what really was going on there was a sort of conflict between two different politico-business networks, and Jokowi was doing quite an amateur job of managing these elite conflicts in his first year, and that sort of dominated a lot of the different, or it determined a lot of the decisions that were made in places like the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, and conflict over the electricity development program, for example. And really what's happened is Jokowi has sort of turned his back on Yusuf Kalla and those networks and has really shut him out of a lot of the most strategic policy programs and strategic decisions that have taken place over the past 2 years. And really I think the moment when Yusuf Kalla was severely weakened was that moment in the Golkar Munaslup, in the Golkar internal ballot, because what I didn't mention in the paper was that not only were Jokowi and Luhut both pushing for Setia Novanto to win, but Yusuf Kalla was backing one of the other candidates. And so when that candidate, Ade Komarudin, lost, that really weakened Yusuf Kalla's influence as well, both within government and within Golkar. So I really think that he has become a little bit of a lame vice presidential candidate over the past year. And I mean, to look into the crystal ball and ask whether he would run again, he's getting very old. I think it's probably what would prevent him from making another bid as a vice presidential candidate or as anything else in 2019. So yeah, I hope that sort of answered your question. I'll leave the second question to Bayu.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's been different since Suharto that now GBHN is not applied in Indonesia because now people rely on presidents, now Jokowi's Nyawacita, and then will be tested in the next 5 years. But I would like to comment on the next election in 2019 because there is a concurrent pilkada, so the election of presidential and legislative election will be at the same time. But now it's still unclear whether the party who can nominate the president, whether the party which is past the requirement for election in 2019 or the party which is passing the level now in 2014 election. This is not clear now at the moment. About the role of volunteers, it seems that if we see the case of Ahok, which first of all want to run independently using the Teman Ahok and then move to the political party, it seems that political party seems very important. And of course, these three names that I mentioned, Risma, Ridwan Kamil, and also Ahok, face the limitation and the character of Indonesian voters related to gender, to ethnicity, all of those things. So it seems that it's still burdened them to run for the presidency in the short term. Thank you.
Okay, second round of questions, please. I'll try to get a spread from around the class. So, Hamish McDonald, up there, the man with the in the front, and Lydia, you have another. No, okay. So we'll take another from over this side, Miles.
Hamish McDonald from the Saturday paper. You didn't mention one highlight of the cabinet reshuffle, which was Sri Mulyani's return. How is she going to impact that statist nationalist push on Jokowi's part? And secondly, could she emerge as a presidential candidate rivaling Jokowi in 2019?
Good question. Thank you. And in the up there.
Bradley Wood from Strategic and Defence Studies Centre here at ANU. I just wanted to know what other role is the TNI playing in influencing Jokowi's policy apart from shifting his focus for human rights?
Pardon, sorry, can you repeat that one?
In addition to the TNI's influence on his policy for human rights, what other role is it playing in influencing his policies?
And last of all, Miles Cooper.
My name's Miles Cooper. Thank you for the excellent presentation and comments. However, there was no mention of foreign policy. Is that because the President is not interested in foreign policy, or it's not relevant to his re-election ambitions? What do you see as the prospect for a more assertive Indonesian role, both regionally and internationally, within ASEAN and more broadly G20, etc.? Thank you.
Okay, so Sri Mulyani, yes, of course, I didn't highlight what was sort of, I guess, the silver lining of that reshuffle, which was Sri Mulyani's return from the World Bank to take up her old position as finance minister. I think there's been a lot of excitement, and perhaps we should all curb our enthusiasm a little bit. First of all, because Sri Mulyani's been handed a real mess with the tax amnesty law, and he's brought her back to manage a budget that is under serious pressure, and it's depending upon a tax amnesty policy which many are very sceptical about, including Sri Mulyani herself. So first of all, the job that she's been given is incredibly difficult. Now, in terms of whether she'll have the influence to roll back or to sort of manage some of the more statist and nationalist policies in other sectoral ministries, I'm pretty sceptical as well. But I think what will be a really interesting test is this current effort coming from the state-owned enterprises ministry. So it's coming from Sri Mulyani, coming from Rini Somarno to establish these large BUMN or state-owned enterprise holding companies. This is sort of her flagship policy, Rini, and we know how close she is to Jokowi, and we know how much Jokowi respects her and her plans. Now, Sri Mulyani has already begun to flag that she's not a fan of this idea. I think her words were, "Why would we put a whole bunch of sick people together? Let's not do this unless the companies look healthy." So she's not, obstructing Rini yet, but she's flagging that she would potentially try and put a stop to this sort of this kind of any attempts to give more capital to and to expand the state-owned sector. And that conflict between one of Jokowi's loyalists and between one of the most technocratic and the most professional minister, I think is really going to be a litmus test for Jokowi, and a real test. And then we'll know how much influence Sri Mulyani really has. I have no idea if she has presidential ambitions. There are other people in this room better placed to discuss that, and they'll be speaking in the next session. On human rights, okay, it's not just the TNIs and the particular individuals that Jokowi has placed in cabinet and people he's placed around him that are determining his position on human rights. And I guess the best example is that over this past 12 months, we saw a really horrendous, sort of outpouring of hateful rhetoric and vitriol against the LGBT community in Indonesia. And Jokowi has almost literally said nothing. And I think what that indicates is, okay, perhaps it reflects his own position on this particular issue. But I think overall, he's really just sort of, and I have to repeat this thing, he doesn't want to bikin gaduh. He doesn't want anything that is too disruptive, that is too controversial. And why would he take a controversial position or a progressive position on this issue when it simply doesn't reflect the views of the majority? And so I think when it comes to these sorts of sensitive human rights issues, Jokowi himself doesn't hold particularly liberal or cosmopolitan views. He doesn't reflect on these sorts of things. He doesn't have an intellectual curiosity to reflect on the state's responsibility to enforce universal human rights and things like that. And so I think he's just going to take the conventional and rather conservative position when it comes to the majority of these issues, unless something really serious happens, unless there's sort of a big I can imagine on the death penalty, for example, if there was a particular country that was able to leverage something with Jokowi, something like that, some external force. But other than that, I see just, conservatism for the next 3 or 4 years. Foreign policy, did you want to jump in anywhere? Foreign policy, no, I didn't mention it because he doesn't really have any strong position on important foreign policy issues. But I think that the Indonesian government is going to be forced to play some sort of to take a more assertive position, I think, on a few particularly pressing foreign policy issues. And of course, the big one is the South China Sea. So Indonesia hasn't really taken a position up until now. It's said that it doesn't have any overlapping claims with China, and therefore it can be a sort of neutral arbiter in the tensions that are arising between other countries in Southeast Asia and with China over the South China Sea. But we also know that there are more and more fishing vessels, Chinese fishing vessels, being found in the Natuna Sea, in Indonesia's exclusive economic zone, there have been several incidents recently which look like things may escalate. And at the moment, the policy that the government is taking is that we don't have, this is not a sovereignty issue, it's a legal issue. We're dealing with it, and we're dealing with it in a sort of very passive diplomatic way. And the other big strategy is simply to build up the presence of Indonesia's economic presence in the sea. And to sort of avoid any sort of confrontational language, but to slowly begin to sort of signal to China that within this exclusive economic zone, Indonesia is active, it's exploiting its resources, and that this is, under international law, the right of Indonesia and not of China. But you have all this sort of internal division over this particular issue as well. There's a lot of domestic politics that are determining the government's position on the South China Sea. And one of them is that you have Susi, the fisheries minister, who is she's nationalist, and she's says it in sort of black and white language that, China is in fact encroaching on Indonesia's sovereign borders in the sea. And then you have Luhut Panjaitan saying, well, hang on, maybe we should just invite them formally to exploit our resources. Wouldn't that be a better way to do it? Indonesia's in a very difficult position for a lot of reasons, but mainly they desperately want Chinese investment in infrastructure in particular. There's already a lot of borrowing going on between Indonesia and Chinese state-owned banks. And so to take a really assertive position on something like this is very difficult. And also, Jokowi is quite a big fan of China and the developmental model that China has used. So for all of those reasons, even on this particularly pressing issue, Jokowi is ambivalent to take an assertive position on foreign relations. That was a rather long-winded response. Sorry.
Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for questions and discussion. Just before I will thank the speakers, I just wanted to mention what their morning tea, and indeed I think the afternoon tea arrangements will be. Because of the risk of rain, there'll be two locations, one in the Coombs extension, which is sort of directly behind this building, and the other location will be in the Headley Bull Centre, which is to the side, on your left as you walk out, the big white building. It'll be in the atrium of the Coombs, the Headley Bull building. Last of all, I'd like you to join me in thanking our two speakers for a wonderful start to the update.